Hello and welcome everybody to the Biostasis podcast. Today we have a special episode with my good old friend Peter Voss, who I've known since, I'm not quite sure when because I'm very bad at dates, but sometime back in the 1990s when Peter moved from South Africa to California. We would meet at Marina del Rey, where we both lived, just a couple of blocks from the ocean. It was very pleasant. We would go to regular meetings at Kifune Restaurant, which Peter organized, a nice Japanese restaurant where we talk about life extension, cryonics, the future, all kinds of things. Peter was very much involved with X-Trip Institute and the X-Ray conferences, and we've stayed in touch ever since I moved out of California, 23 years ago now. Peter has been talking about artificial intelligence for many years, but not just talking. Unlike most people, he actually, way before the big companies got involved, started efforts to actually build advanced artificial intelligence or artificial general intelligence, and has some quite different perspectives on that from what you may be hearing in recent years. So we're going to get to that, talk about AI, AGI, all those issues. But first of all, since this is kind of a biostasis podcast, we'll talk a little bit about that first of all. So welcome, Peter. Can you tell us a little bit about how you got interested in these ideas in the first place? By these ideas, meaning cryonics, biostasis, life extension, and related issues.
Well, pretty much credit you. I was very fortunate when I came from South Africa to Los Angeles, initially just for a short visit, a few months visit. And I was introduced through somebody at a skeptics conference. Somebody said, "You've got to meet my friend Max Moore," because I was all excited about technology and AI and so on. So I met Max in 1995, and it was just fantastic. I mean, Max introduced me to so many new ideas for me because South Africa, wasn't that advanced in terms of cutting edge technology. So I learned about nanotechnology and cryonics and the latest in AI and calorie restriction. And also, I was like a kid in a candy store. I mean, it was just amazing to be exposed to all of these ideas. And I met quite a few of the authors of books I'd read in South Africa. And I mean, it was like amazing, to actually meet Eric Drexler and Nathaniel Brandon and Roy Walford.
Right. Our neighbor, practically, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it was just fantastic. And actually, in honor of that, I'm wearing this T-shirt.
Oh, fantastic. The Extra 3 t-shirt. Yes, from, what would that be, 1998?
Yeah, 1998, I think. And yeah, I mean, it's just such a pity that, the Extra P Institute in philosophy didn't take over the world as we had hoped, because I think it's just such fantastic ideas about rationality, self-ownership, and, proactive optimism that we need to do stuff to create a better world, but that we can. So, yeah, it was just fantastic meeting Max and Natasha and various other people I met through Max. So that was a really exciting time in my life. I did a lot of additional studying and so on. And cryonics was one of the topics that I didn't really know about. I hadn't come across it before. So I might have seen some little, show on TV in South Africa or something, but probably just wrote it off as California craziness, And anyway, so I did my research, and, the question was, is there anything in science that prevents us from working? Is there anything that we know that says, this can't possibly work? And no, I didn't find that. And the second thing was, is this just, a scam, basically? They're just going to take my money and run with it. So, I went to Alcor and met people there, and it became clear very, very quickly that, these people are extremely dedicated, and, they really, really want this to work. And so it was pretty easy for me to decide to sign up for cryonics, probably in 96 or 97. I don't remember, probably 96.
Was Alcor still in California at that time? I think they moved around that time.
No, they had moved. They had just moved. Yeah, they had just moved. Yeah.
And what appealed to you about the idea of life extension and cryonics or biostasis as a way to get to that future?
Well, I love life, and the thing that really struck me is there's a lot we learn in life, and after a couple of divorces and failed businesses and successful business and successful relationships and so on, we kind of finally get the hang of life, and then we die. It makes no sense to me. Just kind of when we're beginning to learn how to live, how to play this game of life, then we die. So no, I love life, and I'd love to live, kind of have an indefinite lifespan. Live for until I don't feel like living anymore, which I don't know how long that would be. And also met Roy Walford and got introduced to calorie restriction, and I've basically been practicing calorie restriction now for almost 30 years, and to try and stay as healthy as possible for as long as possible. So hopefully I don't have to go into the DUA. But also the later you can go into the DUA, the better the technology will be for suspension, and the more we will have learned.
And the less likely the organization is to collapse or get banned because of a shorter time period.
Yeah, absolutely. The stronger the organizations are, the better. So lots of reasons why you want, if you're going to go on the DUA, you want to go as late as possible and as healthy as possible.
Now, you said something that to just highlight, because I think it's important, and it's a point I keep bashing people over the head with. You said that you like to live basically as indefinitely and for as long as you want to live. You didn't say I want to live forever, which that's good, because I really don't like the term forever or immortality. That's not really what we're talking about. So I think that's a very good point, for as long as you want, because you have no idea how long that is. When people ask me how long do you want to live, I say, well, I don't know, ask me again in 100 years or 1,000 years, because how can I tell?
Right. And immortality is even worse when people use that term, because that sort of implies you can't die. Even if you really don't feel like living anymore, and you've thought about it and you say, look, I've done everything I want to do, and really, life isn't fun anymore, and I don't see it getting any better for me. So, then you check out.
Yeah.
Or there may be other options at that point that, you put yourself in biostasis again and say, wake me up in 1,000 years or whatever.
Yeah.
But, we'd have those options.
Yeah. If we get locked into 1,000-year totalitarian regime, maybe we can skip that and come back later. Yeah. Okay. Very good. Let's see. So what do you think? So you said hopefully won't have to be cryopreserved. What do you think actually the odds of that? If we can ask you in politely what your age is and how long you think you probably have, and how much chance do you think there will be that we can advance to a stage where you won't need to be cryopreserved at all?
Yeah, life reversal. Yeah, actually, let me just quickly talk about sort of my experience with cryonics, because that also sort of colors, how badly you actually don't want to be preserved on the one hand, because I actually ran the Southern California Emergency Rescue Team for about 5 years, where we would be the first responders for Elcor members when they go down. And I was personally involved in about, I think, 7 suspensions. In one case, I was the only person who responded, and I had to give all the meds and do everything. And it strikes you on the one hand just how primitive the technology still is, and on the other hand, that's the only chance you're giving this person to potentially come back. So it's really, on the one hand, as man, this is really primitive and damaging, and and so on. Why can't we do better? Then on the other hand, well, if we weren't doing it, they definitely wouldn't be coming back. Right. So it's not a good option, and that's why most of us are also very interested in age reversal and drastic life extension, that we don't have to go, and that's basically aging has to be reversed, not just slowed down, but we actually have to reverse it and rejuvenate ourselves. Now, in terms of when that might happen, there's sort of an emotional reaction I have to it, and then there's a sort of cognitive, deliberate reaction that I have. the emotional reaction is there's been so little progress. You know, when I first met Max, it was like, oh, we're going to solve nanotechnology in the next 5 to 10 years. You know, we're going to cure cancer, we're going to get age reversal, we're going to get AI. And, you know, it seemed like it was 5 or 10 years away, some of these breakthroughs.
The late 90s were exciting time. Yeah, it seemed like things
Yeah.
were taking off.
And, you know, it's now 30 years later, and nanotechnology, there's been essentially no progress in terms of molecular nanotechnology. They've pretty much given up on it. And anti-aging, age reversal, I mean, it's become clear just how hard that problem is, incredibly hard. You know, I'm also involved on the scientific review committee for cryonics research. And I've been on that committee also for more than 20 years. And it's just really hard. It's really hard to solve biological problems. So it's not very optimistic, and that's kind of the emotional component. You know, it seems like we're never going to solve this. It's just well, maybe not never, but it's just really a long way out. I mean, it's really, really hard. You know, to even improve cryonics, but you know, also following anti-aging science. Then, on the other hand, of course, I've been deeply involved in AI, and I do firmly believe that we can have full human level AI within just a few years. And then everything changes. But we don't have an intuition for that. We don't have an, you know, it's never happened before. And even the very rapid rise of large language models and that, yeah, it's very, you know, it's very fast and very exciting and so on. But they're really still quite dumb, actually. And we can talk about that. You know, there's no way they significantly help to speed up this kind of research.
I think that
So
those are amazingly good and useful, but also very dumb at the same time. It's an interesting thing, depending on the perspective you take.
yeah, and what you're trying to use. It really, I tend to say, you know, we seem to be so close to human level AI, and yet so far. You know, it's in some things they are just so amazing, and in other things they're just like incredibly stupid. So, but once we have true AGI, a system that can truly learn and reason by itself autonomously without hallucinations and so on, and we can then have this army of researchers in all different fields. When you know nanotechnology could advance very very rapidly, and obviously biological research, aging research, and chronics research could all advance very very rapidly. Now, of course, there's still the gating factor of physical reality. And I think we'll be talking more about that. I mean, there are certain things, certain trials, and certain things you do, they just have to happen in real time. You know, I mean, even if you have the most fantastic robot surgeon or whatever, the biological thing you're working on, whether it's a mouse or a human or whatever, then has to heal. And even with accelerated healing, you know, that takes time before you kind of know, well, did that really solve the problem and so on. So there are those real time constraints. But with AGI, think about it rationally. I think we do have a really good chance to conquer aging with, you know, within my lifetime. I just turned 71. So I hopefully have a bit of time for technology to catch up, and hopefully I can make AGI happen to accelerate this whole process. But yeah, they're tough problems. I mean, most problems in reality are actually really really hard.
It's yeah. I mean, it's to just take a perspective. It's funny because yesterday I was lying in the pool enjoying a 110-degree heat here in Phoenix, and it's really nice at night, just lying in the pool and looking at the planes flying overhead. And it's it's a trivial example that we're so familiar with, but I thought it was only a little over 100 years where we had never, through the entirety of human existence, flown, and now we just take it for granted. So we know these impossible things happen. There are lots of people saying this was impossible when it happens. So that's a very poor argument. I've talked about the argument from lack of imagination, but this really is a hard problem. Otherwise, we would have solved aging, or at least made some major progress. And people have been working on this, obviously, for actually thousands of years, and scientifically for quite a long time too. So I guess my question is, You talked about how with AGI or AI we would have many millions more researchers, potentially even billions, I suppose, and that should really accelerate progress. What about someone who says, well, yeah, but look at the universities where we've got more and more people doing research and publishing papers, but a lot of it's garbage and isn't actually helping. So having more won't necessarily help. Um, Obviously, you've got a lot more speed in terms of the scanning of all the information and collating it, which is really incredible research tool. Um, but if current AIs are based basically on human cognition or sort of copying it using statistical techniques, not actually doing it the same way, um, what if aging is a problem that is actually beyond human intelligence? What if it requires something with actually different cognitive structures or ways of thinking, not just the best of humans, but actually something beyond that? Do you think that's a possibility, or do you think that we'll have? And we can talk about what actual superintelligence means. That's a kind of interesting question itself. But let's just stick with AI for now.
Yes. So AGI itself will have, as a minimum, the intelligence and flexibility of a smart human at a minimum, but it will also automatically be much, much better than a human, because you can easily engineer an AI with photographic memory, that humans can't have. It has instantaneous access to whatever information is online. It can essentially just think about something and download that into its brain, which we can't do. And and it's much better at rational thought. It doesn't suffer these you know our ability to think rationally is not actually very good. It's kind of an evolutionary afterthought. We're not really very good at that. Whereas an AI inherently can be designed, it can much more easily overcome cognitive biases, even though it might be a cognitive architecture, but it'll be able to detect and control for cognitive biases, because it'll also be tireless. It can be designed in a way that it can just tirelessly go through things. Whereas, we have confirmation bias and all sorts of other cognitive fallacies that we fall into.
But
And
let me just stop you there for a second,
yeah,
Peter, because that's an interesting one. Because and I'm not sure whether you're talking about current AI or future AI, because current AI seems to be does fall into it doesn't necessarily think rationally. It actually, especially these days, the AI wants to agree with you and tell you how wonderful you are and how brilliant your ideas are. It seems there's a tendency to do that, and it's
yeah,
based on what it finds. It's kind of like, in a way, like a massive Wikipedia, right? Some Wikipedia is really accurate and very helpful, and others is very biased. And we've seen, of course, AI is producing the founding fathers looking like all black people and so on, things that aren't actually realistic. So, are you talking about current AIs or future
no,
ones?
not at all.
Yeah.
I need to make that clear. And let me quote Jan LeCun, the chief scientist at Meta here. He says, large language models are an off-ramp to AGI, a distraction, a dead end. And I totally agree with him. So when I talk about future AI and talk about AGI, it's nothing like what we're doing right now with large language models. I mean, these large language models, it's kind of they're extremely impressive. I mean, let me be very clear in what they do. When ChatGPT first came out, it blew us away. I mean, anybody working in the field of AI is, how is this possible? How can a
Yeah.
dumb system be that smart?
Yeah.
Just a
It's crazy.
statistical system.
Yeah.
So they really are extremely impressive. But it's also insane when you step back and kind of think about this from first principles. They use 30 trillion pieces of information and number crunch them for hundreds of millions of dollars worth, and then have a model that is frozen in time. It's a read only model. It cannot learn anything more. And you compare that to a human brain, 20 watts, a child can learn with a few million words, literally a million times less data, but we learn incrementally, one thing at a time. We don't need a nuclear power station to power our brains. So it's fundamentally the wrong approach. It's just, it happened that the large companies, it's kind of an accident of history, the large companies had a lot of data, had a lot of compute, so that's a hammer they had. And they found a lot of nails
Mm.
that they could basically just train bigger and bigger models. And to everyone's surprise, they did some really magical things. But it's fundamentally just the wrong approach. You need a system that can learn incrementally, that can form new hypotheses based on what learned, that can adjust its knowledge, its thinking. These large language models simply cannot do that. Whatever was baked in on those 30 trillion pieces of information, which are good, bad, and ugly. And the system doesn't know what's good, what's bad, what's ugly, doesn't know where they come from. So it's fundamentally the wrong approach. Now, I'm talking about the next generation of AI that will truly lead us to AGI, that, where the system can learn autonomously. You'll have basically say a college graduate AI or AGI that can now hit the books and teach itself to be a cancer researcher or an aging researcher. And they'll just be a lot more effective. Also, I mean, look at research, how distorted research is. The incentives in research are just completely crazy.
Absolutely.
And you have people's egos getting in the way, and then kind of, grant proposals and, all of, just kind of a waste of time having to always quote a whole bunch of other people and
having to fit it into the DI perspective or whatever it is your funders want you to do.
Yeah. And whereas if you have, thousands and millions of AGIs that are just focused on actually solving the problem and not the politics and playing political games and protecting their ego and advancing their careers and, all those kinds of distractions that you have, make tremendous progress. Apart from the technical benefits that they have, that they will, a human can't read every new paper that came out in their field. Even in a narrow field, they simply don't have the time and motivation. But an AGI could, or at least a cluster of AGIs could, and then also be much more rational in terms of saying, look, this particular approach, we now have enough evidence that this simply cannot work, whereas in current medicine, some of the things tend to have so much momentum, a particular approach, to dealing with Alzheimer's or diabetes or something. There's so much money, so much momentum, and, what insurance will pay for and so on. It's very hard for people to then ignore that, say, okay, look, that doesn't work. Let's do something else. Whereas an AGI would be able to sort through, the papers and the experiments that have been done much more effectively and really find more promising avenues and explore them.
I think an interesting example of, one of many examples, unfortunately, of, research being probably led astray. You mentioned Alzheimer's, of course, the amyloid hypothesis. Now, recently, people are saying actually that's probably wrong or mostly wrong, and it's actually we're spending trillions or billions and billions of dollars in the wrong direction there because of institutional incentives, because the journal editors can adopt that viewpoint. It's like with diets, people have there's an official government diet, so you get funded for producing the food pyramid and the stupid plate rather than actually the good stuff. So it's a huge problem, and just eliminating that could be massively good for productivity just on its own. One thing I'd be to ask you, as far as I can tell, the current LLM models don't seem to be well trained on rational thinking. I mean, whenever I asked, Chat or Grok or Claude, I tend to use 3 or 4 to get different answers. I never get an answer that says, well, let me first of all check for rationality. Let me scan all the lists of logical fallacies and ways of going wrong, and that might be implicit in your questions or in the way I answer it. I never see that. I don't know if they actually do any specific training on that. I mean, presumably it's part of the training corpus in general, but do they really focus on that and put that up front?
No, not at all.
I don't see any evidence.
And in fact, they can't, because it's all about quantity and not the quality of training. No, they can't. I mean, it just, they do a bit of fine tuning to try and sort of get rid of the most egregious kind of responses that you have. And then, of course, the other problem you have, it's inherently statistical, and that's baked in. They have to be statistical. So I can give you, one sort of clear example of why you get hallucinations and why they're so unreliable is, imagine you asking it a yes-no question where the answer is yes or no. And let's say the correct answer is yes. But statistically, it just happens to flip it to a no. It now feeds back the no as an input, and it's now committed to basically completing the sentence to kind of justify the no answer.
Mm-hmm.
And that's basically how these why these systems can come up with completely absurd stuff that once they go off tracks randomly, basically then they're kind of committed to somehow make that coherent, because what they're trained on is basically to create coherent output,
Right.
that something that kind of sounds right.
Yeah. Yeah. That probably explains. My experience. This is something I've seen more recently, and I think as they've adjusted the AIs to do this more, they've become too agreeable. So, for instance, I can't remember what the topic was, but I asked. I think it was chat. Um, I suggested something, and
Mhm.
it got the idea that this idea was a wrong idea. And so it then sort of gave me all the reasons why it was wrong. Then I said, actually, no, I think you're wrong because of this, this, and this. It said, oh, you're completely right. What a brilliant observation. They gave me all kind of
Yeah,
reasons for the opposite of what
right.
it just said.
Oh yeah. No, it's a well-known problem now. And in fact, OpenAI pulled one of their models because it was just too too bad, and it was like
Too obsequious.
and they actually pulled it. But yeah, it's just it's a huge problem. But the fundamental technology is just wrong. When you have a cognitive AI, DARPA calls it the third wave of AI. Let me just quickly go over that. DARPA a few years ago came out with a paper where they talk about the three waves of AI. And the first wave is what we now call good old-fashioned AI. Those were expert systems, largely logic-based systems, and so on. With Deep Blue, IBM's World Chess Champion, was a good example of that. That's the first wave logic. Now they were pretty brittle and they didn't really work that well. And the second wave then hit us like a tsunami when people figured out how they could use massive amounts of information and train these deep learning models, and now large language models, that just have been quite successful obviously in a number of areas: speech recognition, translation, image recognition, and kind of brainstorming, very good summarization and stuff like that. That's the second wave. The third wave is basically when you start looking at first principles of intelligence. Your starting point is what makes human intelligence special, and then you very quickly come to the conclusion it's our ability to adapt to changing circumstances, changing knowledge. That we learn on the fly with very limited information. We can generalize, we can think about it. We have metacognition that can adjust our thinking, can update our thinking. And that's really what you need. And once you have an AI built on the third wave or cognitive AI, then you can get to true AGI that can learn new things by itself.
Mm. And you're saying that, with that kind of third level that humans have, we can do these things. Of course, we often don't do these things because we're driven by a lot of biases and evolutionary drives that make want us to seek things other than the truth. Whereas AI presumably won't have those things. Is that right?
Exactly. That's exactly right. So, I mean, a lot of what we do and say is driven by our reptile brain, basically, loosely speaking. I mean, it's basically survival and reproduction, our egos. And as I said earlier, rational thinking is an evolutionary afterthought. We only just slightly beginning to learn how to do that and train ourselves how to do that. But we are still very much driven by sort of the emotional components, on really that have their foundation in survival and reproduction.
Mm-hmm. And just to clarify, for myself as well as other people watching, you mentioned good old-fashioned AI, and back in the late 80s, early 90s, when I was doing my PhD, I did a course on cognitive psychology, because we looked at that, and Jerry Fodor on the Go side, and other people on the neural net side. So it was the good old-fashioned AI, the symbolic processing versus the neural networks. Now, how would you classify the current approach? Is that a neural networks? We call it deep learning, and it doesn't seem to be quite the same thing as the old thing we talk about with neural networks, but it seems to have something in common. Could you maybe clarify?
Oh yeah, it's pretty much neural networks. It's just the transformer architecture is kind of an evolution of that. But before we had transformers, we already had a lot of progress in deep learning. But they really are just neural networks on steroids. It's the biggest change really is using massive amounts of data, which they could never do in the 80s and 90s. They just didn't have the data, didn't have the compute. And yes, a few algorithmic tweaks, but they are essentially neural networks.
Mm-hmm. So I wonder, it kind of makes me think then, of course, for a long time, Marvin Minsky, I think, unfairly gets the blame for this, but back in the day, he wrote a paper, I think it was with Papert, right, on perceptrons, where he basically showed that a two-layer network can't really do anything very interesting. And people blame him for destroying progress in AI, but it's really not his fault. I mean, someone could have tried the experiment. Let's have some intervening layers, but so you can't blame him for that. And that, of course, led to a whole explosion of new possibilities. Do you think there's any parallel with that today? Is there any sort of unquestioned assumption that's limiting current LLM approaches that could actually lead to something more like what you want, or do you think it's fundamentally limited at this point?
Yeah, I mean, so neural networks pretty much, there are some exceptions, but when people talk about neural networks, almost all of the neural networks, and certainly large language models, that use backpropagation, some form of backpropagation. Now, what that means is basically you need to have all of your training data up front. So you collect all of the training data, and for large language models, as I said, it's literally 30 trillion pieces of information. And then you number crunch that millions of times until the network sort of represents the statistics of the data. And so it's basically bulk training. And then you end up with a model that is read-only. And that's pretty much what everybody is doing in neural networks. Now, the blind spot in my mind, quite clearly, is our brains don't do that. Our brains don't use backpropagation. We don't need all the information that we're ever going to learn up front. I mean, it's kind of absurd. So the huge blind spot here is incremental learning, real-time learning. And the way neural networks are set up, large language models are set up, they cannot do that. It's quite impossible. In fact, I co-authored a white paper a few months ago where we did a review of recent papers, people trying to get large language models to be updated in real time. And we reference over 200 papers in our review. Not a single one was able to update the core model. It just cannot be done. Once you commit yourself to a backpropagation kind of system, it's baked in. You're basically done. They're just, when people try to retrain them, you get catastrophic forgetting and fine tuning and very limited tweaks you can actually do to these models once they are trained. And that's really a blind spot in AI now. Is, I believe, the solution is to build systems that can learn in real time. That has to be an absolute essential. That you say, okay, forget everything else, but we have to have a system that can learn in real time. Now, once you make that commitment, then you basically can start solving the problem, because you automatically are going to eliminate backpropagation and all the things that go with it. And you basically start looking elsewhere for solutions. So yeah, there is absolutely a blind spot there. Now, the architecture that we've developed, and that I believe makes sense, that people are talking about now, is what they call neurosymbolic, which basically is the way most people think about it. It's a combination of first wave and second wave. So you take symbolic systems like expert systems, logic systems, essentially, and you somehow combine them as with deep learning networks or large language models. You combine them, and the hope is that you would basically overcome the limitations of the large language model and overcome the limitations of the logic system. But in fact, by gluing these two things together, it's the opposite. You get the worst of both worlds in a way. I mean, you basically can't really do that, because your knowledge representation has to be common. if you think about, there's a rough analogy that you can think about our system one thinking, and I guess most of your viewers will be familiar with Daniel Kahneman's fast and slow thinking, where system one is your sort of subconscious thinking, and then system two is a conscious, deliberate thought. Now, we don't have two completely separate systems for that. They're totally integrated. They have the same knowledge representation, and we can dynamically shift between system one and system two. If you're learning to play guitar, it's system two, put this finger here, that finger there, and then after a while it becomes automated, and then that becomes system one, and then you can concentrate on your strumming, exactly how you strum. That becomes automated, and then you can, focus on intonation and rhythm and whatever. Once you're done with that, you can concentrate on the audience. So you need to have this integrated system, and that's actually what our technology is called, integrated neurosymbolic architecture, where your knowledge representation is the same for your wave one, wave two, or system one, system two, for your, pattern matching system, pattern activation system versus your symbolic system. And I believe that is the way to go, is to have this fundamentally different approach that addresses the requirements of human cognition.
Recently, there's been a lot more discussion of new reasoning modes, like with Grok, which I quite like Grok right now, one of my favorite ones. And you can either get a very quick answer, or you can give it a couple of minutes to really chew on the problem. Right. Is the kind of reasoning it doing, is that anything like what you're talking about, or is it just reapplication on some way of the same thing?
No, it's really much more along the lines of reprompting, that the system basically is set up in a way to kind of ask itself questions, but it's still all a truly automated system. It still has all the hallucinations, but it's basically a way of the system reprompting itself. There's no metacognition. There's no higher level that really understands the reasoning process, or the problem is it still doesn't know what it doesn't know. It doesn't know what's right or wrong, and in its knowledge. So having that thinking mode, the deliberation mode, obviously helps to solve some of the more complex problems by essentially replacing the human who might have asked follow-up questions. It kind of the system can ask itself sort of a standard.
Yeah, and I like the way, at least in some of these systems, it actually shows you the way it's thinking, which is good too. It makes you help you actually track whether it's doing it right and whether it's using the right.
Well, there's actually a number of papers, one in particular, where they actually looked inside what the system is actually doing when it was adding numbers to or multiplying numbers or something. And what it told you what it was doing was what you would expect a human to say, because that's in its training set. What it was actually doing, though, was pattern matching, which was very, very different. So even when it's telling you how it's thinking, it's lying to you, or it could be lying to you.
Well, that's actually not so different from humans, from a lot of the experiments in psychology now, where they show basically that much of the time we don't really, the reasons we give for our behavior aren't necessarily the actual reasons.
That's true. Yeah, that's true.
Mm-hmm. Well, let me ask you, okay, you talked about how these systems need trillions of tokens, and of course that's gotten quite expensive now, and it tends to be very large companies that have to do this. What do you think about DeepSeek? And I read some of the initial stuff on that. I haven't really followed up as to how much they made use of previous work. Does that really have anything like a different architecture that's much more efficient, or do you think they're just riding on the coattails of existing systems with a few tweaks?
Well, I think there's also some misinformation when they talk about how little money they spent. I think there are other reports that they've also had many millions or tens of millions of funding before. And reverse engineering and copying somebody else's system, of course, is always a lot quicker. Now, I'm not that familiar with the details, but it looks like they did, having less money available made them more creative, and they came up with a few shortcuts that have made these systems more efficient. Basically, that they require less compute to get similar results. But but it is fundamentally the same technology.
Since we can see in the corner of the screen there, AIGO, it says, would you like to explain how you're putting ideas into practice with your company?
Yeah, sure. So unfortunately, when well, let me go back a step just to give the background. So in South Africa, I had a software company that did fairly well. We went from the garage to 400 people and did an IPO. And it's when I exited that company, I had enough time and money on my hands to say, okay, what big problem do I want to tackle next?
Mm-hmm.
And, what struck me is that software is really quite dumb, that, software doesn't have common sense. And if the programmer didn't think of something, it just crashes or gives you an error message. So how can we solve that? And I actually took off 5 years to study intelligence, starting with epistemology. How do we know anything at all? How can we be certain of things? What is reality? And how can we know it? What is free will? And where does consciousness fit in? So I studied all of those things and to try
all the easy questions.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so those are now kind of pretty much behind me, but to try and figure out, so how would that work in a computer? If we have free will and we want a computer to have the sort of human intelligence, then how would that work? And same with consciousness. And then I studied cognitive psychology in terms of where do emotions fit in, how do children learn, what do IQ tests measure, why is our intelligence so much better than animal intelligence, so much more powerful. And I studied, of course, what had already been done in the field of AI. So at the end of the 5 years, I had I came up with a theory of how to build this thinking machine, at least what I hoped would work. And so by that time, I moved to the States. And 2001, I started my first AI company called Adaptive AI Inc., because I believe being adaptive, having adaptive intelligence is kind of the key to human intelligence, that we can adapt to changing circumstances very quickly with limited information, limited time, limited compute, essentially. Mm-hmm. So we spent 5 years basically building various prototypes and exploring my ideas and turning them into code. And by that time, I'd kind of run out of money, and we then had to pivot to commercializing our technology, and which we did for call center automation, a company called Smart Action. Did that for 5 years because building a commercial company is kind of non-trivial. Most companies fail, so we put a lot of effort into not failing. But I ended up with not the right financial partners in the business that didn't really believe in AGI and so on. So we sold that company, then started what is now called IGO. Had to hire a new team, start again pretty much from scratch, but with everything we'd learned previously. Again, another 5 years of development. Again, kind of, okay, now we have to commercialize. And we, until 9 months ago, we were a commercial company. Our best known customers, 1-800-Flowers, Harry and David, group of companies. We did all of their chat support for them using our technology. In fact, last year's Valentine's Day, we replaced 3,000 agents, normally for a 2-week period, 1 week before Valentine's Day and a week after. They usually have to.
Oh, that's very valuable to them, to don't have to hire and fire people.
Yeah. And so, we very successfully automated that. But, about 9 months ago, with so much money being thrown at AI, large language models, I mean, you have kind of the absurd thing where you get $2 billion seed capital at a $10 billion valuation for a company that has no product, no revenue, and not even a particular clear plan to do anything.
The late 1990s internet companies, right?
Yeah. So anyway, we decided, with a commercial company, maybe in a few years' time, we'd be worth a few $100 million. But what we really want to work on is AGI, and we need to focus on getting to full human level AI as soon as possible. So 9 months ago, we basically shut down the commercial business, and we've been focusing on getting to true adult level intelligence. Now, for that, people might ask, well, if we already did customer support, that's adult level with our technology. What's missing?
Mm-hmm.
Well, the big difference is in our commercial business, we always had to put in a lot of external human intelligence to set up the system for a particular application.
Right.
So, for each customer, we would usually put in, have like 5 or 10 people for several months, put in all the business rules and the ontology and, special language rules and whatnot, to basically set up the system to do a particular job. And you have to do that to some degree for every new job. And when something changes, a product changes, or your market, you have different marketing or whatever, your discount structure changes, and again you have to tweak the system. So the system cannot learn autonomously, or at least it can only learn certain things. It can interact with the customer and learn about that customer, but it can't really learn new skills and different language and so on. Now, with our AGI development, it's exactly the opposite. So there we stripped out all of the human-generated rules completely out, and we're teaching the system like a child, like a 3-year-old, 4-year-old, 5-year-old. And we just recently completed a milestone, sort of roughly 4-year-old language and reasoning ability. We're currently working at the 5-year-old level. And, by the time we get to 10, 12-year-old, I mean, we're pretty much done, because from there, the system can really hit the books and just, teach itself the rest of the kind of background knowledge that it needs to have.
And they won't say, I don't want to. They won't do that.
Well, it's not going to have raging hormones, at 10 or 12 or 14. So, yeah, it doesn't have that reptile brain to distract it. So it'll live for basically objectivity, to concord with reality and to be consistent in its knowledge.
So the way you put it made it sound like the commercial approach is really a big distraction to the research. Are there any benefits to having to focus on the commercial products? Or is it really
we certainly learned something in terms of scaling. So we now have a lot of experience in being able to scale up the system. So I'm quite confident that once we can get the IQ up of our system, the scaling will be straightforward.
Mm-hmm.
But I actually call the commercialization, I call it the narrow AI trap. And in fact, pretty much everybody that I've come across who's tried to work on AGI seriously has fallen into the narrow AI trap. And that can either be through commercialization, where suddenly the pressure is on to have the best commercial product, the most effective commercial product as quickly as possible. Mm. And that means basically injecting human knowledge and writing code to achieve the specific objective. But even in academia, you have the same problem. If you're trying to achieve AGI, to get your next grant, you need to beat some benchmarks or show some improvement or something. So you again kind of narrowly, improving the system by hook or by crook to basically beat benchmarks or make it interesting that you can get your next grant or they can get your PhD, supported.
Yeah.
And it's really, really hard to just concentrate on the work that needs to be done. And, a 3-year-old is not going to beat any benchmarks. It's not going to not have any commercial viability. A 4-year-old, 5-year-old, 6-year-old. But you've got to go through those stages where you really have to have your own internal benchmarks. Am I achieving the cognitive development that needs to be done? And, you can't have people, well, can it beat ChatGPT at something? Well, no, unless we're competing on equal footing where you also only have 1 million training tokens.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then of course we'd beat the pants off large language models. You can't do anything with, a million tokens.
So are you having to sort of just operate with the money that you had from the company, or do you think there's a real prospect of getting funding? Because I mean, so much money in AI, but it's all different paradigm, as you say. So
Yeah, I know it's quite tough. No, I mean we're only 15 people in the company, and currently I'm funding the company, and I can only do so much. Unfortunately, I can't scale up. So we are looking to get a Series A to we're trying to raise 25 million dollars to hire another 40 or 50 people. And we believe we can get to full human level in 2 years with a bigger team. But it's actually pretty hard to get funding for it, in spite of 2 billion seed capital being thrown at large language models. Especially when you start talking to VCs, most of them, the majority of them are followers. They'll just follow the trends, and their first question they ask, who else is investing in your company, and is that any big VC I know? Well, if it is, I want in, and if there isn't a big VC already investing in your company, then well, I don't know, we follow basically. They might not admit to that, but that's and then the leads, the big ones. It's pretty hard to actually get to the principals, and the gatekeepers. Typically, you explain the story to them, and their eyes just glaze over. That this is nothing like what I hear every day about large language models, and how many GPUs do you get, and where you're going to get your training data, and which model are you going to put a wrapper around, and how it's completely different language that you're speaking there. And so it's pretty hard to actually. Oh, and then the other thing is, VCs are not in the mode of learning. They're always in they get hundreds of proposals. They are in the mode of critiquing things and finding holes in them.
Yeah.
Whereas they really have to unlearn some of the things they know, and you typically don't have enough time and the right environment where you can have like the conversation we're having now and kind of explain why incremental learning, for example, real-time incremental learning is absolutely key. And if you don't have that, you're not going to get to AGI, And then I say, well, but we're making a lot of money with this, a lot of money to be made with large language models, and and then of course you have the other thing that the distortion of what AGI really means. When Sam Altman says, "Oh, we'll have AGI soon, but it's not going to be a big deal," well, he's either lying or he's ignorant or both. When we get
AGI, a different
AGI,
definition of AGI. So well, let's talk about that, because that's an interesting question. As just yesterday, I posted something up from my personal blog, and on LinkedIn, you posted some disagreements with that. But I think it raises a lot of interesting issues, because I don't think there's an official definition of any of these things. There's kind of competing definitions. So I think saying someone's wrong or whatever, it kind of depends partly on how you're defining it. So I think one thing I'm sure we could agree on is that human, at least with the current systems, not the ones you're talking about, with the current systems, there is some overlap in what our capabilities are. But obviously, there's a lot of differences, and everybody knows Moravec's paradox, right? That things that humans are good at, machines find particularly difficult, and vice versa. So what is AGI? Does it mean that an AI has to be able to do everything that a human can do, every cognitive task, or does it include every physical task, through robots as well? Does it mean it can conceive of things like new theories in physics that are actually beyond the capability of the human brain? How do we want to define AI versus AGI versus super intelligent AGI?
Yeah.
What is your take?
Well, as you probably know, I coined the term together with Ben Goertzel and Shane Legg in 2002. So, yes, you don't own the term once it's out there, and people can obviously redefine it and distort it and so on. And even 7 or 8 years ago, my Facebook group, I had to call it real AGI, because the term AGI had already been so abused and distorted. So I think the original idea of AGI is to have thinking machines that can think, learn, and reason the way humans can. And G is the general, which means assuming you have, say, a smart college graduate, that might be a good reference point. But typically we exclude robotics because that has its own kind of requirements and problems. So assume you have a smart college graduate working behind a computer, basically any remote job that is cognitive of nature. So we can also maybe exclude artistic, let's just put those aside. So any cognitive job, a smart human can learn to perform remotely via computer. Now, because it's a computer, it will automatically have several advantages. You could obviously speed it up, and as I mentioned earlier, it can have photographic memory and just a lot of advantages. So it'll inherently already be superhuman by having calculator kind of built in, and other things. But the important thing is that it can learn like a human, that it doesn't need massive amounts of data and like a training run or training set. And the simplest example of why you can see that large language models are way, way off AGI is you cannot take a large language model and put it into a call center like you or I. We could, if we go into a call center now, any call center that, first level call center, I'm not talking about specialized, we'd read the manuals, listen to some calls, ask some questions. Maybe they have a training program or whatever. And, a few hours or certainly a few days later, but certainly measured in hours, we would be able to take calls. And when we can't handle a call, we would also know it, and we'd know when to ask the supervisor. Large language models are nowhere near. They're miles away from being able to do that. In fact, they can never do it because they cannot learn incrementally. Mm-hmm. So that's a key requirement of AGI, is the ability to learn like a human, to acquire new knowledge and new skills interactively, and then to be able to generalize them, drawing on other experience, being able to find analogies and so on. So that's really AGI, the definition. And an AGI like that could, train itself to become a programmer, to become an accountant, manager, administrator, researcher, any of these things. And this is really, to me, the only definition of singularity that ever made sense to me, is when you get to a point that an AGI can become, among other things, an AGI researcher, that it can, conceptually think about it, not just kind of brute force or try different things, but when conceptually understand its own design and improve it and come up, with improved design. And then, of course, you do have this kind of continuous improvement. So that's AGI. And the reason I say ASI as a marketing term is for people who've so watered down AGI that they can say, oh, we have AGI now, or we'll have it soon, but we're not going to have super intelligence for a long time. It makes no sense to me. Once you have AGI, it will already be super intelligent, and calculator super intelligent. But there isn't a separate stage at which you would say, this is now super intelligent. Once it's smart enough to basically understand its own design and improve it conceptually, you basically there, and it's already super intelligent, and you have a seed AI basically that's self-improving.
Well, okay, so let me push back a little bit on that, because the way I'm not, maybe I'm just idiosyncratic, but the way I think of super intelligent, again, it's kind of a blurry thing. So obviously the fact, being able to think a million times faster does make you super intelligent. In some sense, we'll be able to scan all the world's information, or hold all that in your mind at once is super intelligent in a sense. But there's kind of a strong sense of super intelligence, which, I'm not sure if this makes sense or not. But just think about it this way: it seems kind of amazing to me that we evolved, a pretty simple environment, and basically our brain hasn't really changed much in 100,000 years, and yet somehow these brains are able to not just avoid getting eaten by tigers, but they can also come up with general relativity. That seems kind of surprising that the brain is able to do that. So are there things out there that we don't know yet that our brain, as it is, could not ever conceive of? If that's a possibility, could there be things that even what you're calling a super intelligent AI, it could be self-improving. Maybe does that necessarily mean it could solve any conceivable problem that we haven't come across? Maybe things that are so complex a brain could never handle it. Do you think that would be a level where you've got the AI that can solve all kinds of stuff that humans could in principle if we were fast enough, but maybe not a certain level of problem? Do you think that's a useful distinction?
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question, but one would need to define ASI then in some way that would be meaningful, and
Difficult, yeah.
that it would be kind of a step change
Right.
in that. Now, one of the things we do actually know, and that's not likely to change, is that most problems in reality are inherently intractable in terms of trying to just think them through. And the reason for that is that basically chaos theory that we have, and Stephen Wolfram's rule, forget what the number is, but has a he came up with a very, very simple algorithm, a few lines of code that it's proven that you cannot predict its outcome. So it's chaotic, like weather patterns or whatever. And we also have quantum uncertainty and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And so we know we will never be able to predict the weather exactly in a place 2 weeks, 2 months from now. It's impossible.
Mm-hmm.
And there are lots of like trying to predict political outcomes of political actions and so on. All sorts of things in the real world are inherently unpredictable, and it doesn't matter how smart a system is going to be. We actually know that most real life problems are intractable in that regard. In terms of prediction or modeling, modeling them accurately enough.
So there's no godlike intelligence with AI.
Correct, yeah. And that's actually a very good point to make, because there are a lot of people who seem to think that it'll have infinite intelligence, or you'll get to infinite intelligence. That's nonsense. There's no such thing.
Mm.
Now, will it be able to grasp things that we cannot grasp? Yes, I believe that's true. And in fact, I hope they'll help us understand some of the things that are mysteries to us right now. But the foundation of human intelligence, and is one of the really interesting and kind of essential breakthrough things that are understood, is the key of human intelligence is our ability to form abstractions. And the fact that we can form abstractions on top of abstractions on top in virtually an unlimited hierarchy is what allows us to, understand quantum mechanics, or at least to the extent that we do understand it, that we can get that far in our understanding of reality, is our ability to form abstract concepts. And I do expect an AGI to be able to think in more dimensions than we can. But it's still going to have these intractable limits that you basically have a combinatorial explosion of factors to take into account that very quickly explode to, more atoms than there in the universe, or whatever, which clearly cannot be computed by any finite system. So, I hope that AGI will, for example, be able to come up with an understandable explanation of how quantum mechanics works, the particle wave duality, or relativity. These are very unintuitive kinds of things, and we really struggle with them. And hopefully an AGI would help guide us through understanding those kind of things. We can do the math, we can calculate, and a lot of physicists just say, just calculate and shut up. It's, don't bother trying to conceptualize it or understand it. The math works and you're done. Maybe we can't conceptually go beyond that. I don't know, but AGIs will definitely be able to handle a higher level of complexity, but they're not omniscient. They're not godlike. Because complexity just grows much quicker than intelligence can.
Yeah, presumably, just as some humans can think certain kinds of thoughts that others can't because they have calculus or tensor math or whatever. Presumably, AI will be able to invent new systems like that we may never come up with, or may take us millions of years, and they will be thinking ways.
Absolutely, yes. I mean, it'll the AGI will stand on the shoulders of giants. What we've already achieved so far, and it can kind of take it to the next level. So
Yeah.
undoubtedly, it'll come up with new approaches to maths and science that we haven't thought of.
Yeah. So we're kind of getting towards the end of our time, but a couple of other areas. I have to ask this one because it's it's the big thing right now. Should we be worried about AI taking over and killing humans?
No. Well, let me elaborate. Unfortunately, the whole AI risk community has been extremely well funded. $1 billion or more, and they are actually very detached from the reality of AI. Of some really fundamental flaws in their thinking. One of the sort of misalignment things is that they believe that there's some central optimization function, that AIs are inherently designed to optimize for one thing, that you can express in a formula. And that if you get this thing wrong, then you toast, then you have everything turned into paper clips or whatever it is. And that's a fundamental misunderstanding, even how AGI computers can work. They need to have a hierarchy of goals that themselves will change as it understands things. So it's not a fixed formula that if you get it wrong, you toast.
Yeah.
It adjusts. It has a feedback cycle with reality.
That's always struck me as something particularly weird, the paperclip maximizing thing, because on the one hand you're saying, okay, this is a super intelligent AI. On the other hand, it's so stupid that it's just going to maximize paperclips and ignore everything else. That just something doesn't quite work right there.
I know it's really an absurd argument, and the other thing is basically where people assume that it will have human motivations, that it'll have this reptile brain, that'll have a desire to protect itself and reproduce. And no, that's not what we're building. We're not building that into the system, and they're not instrumental goals that automatically appear and will be higher than any of the other goals that we have in the system. So that's not going to happen.
I think every new technology we tend to model on previous things, right? It used to be people thought of the mind as a system of hydraulic pipes because that's what they had, and then it became they're basically like computer chips, none of which are really accurate. I think what might be going on here is that people have got the genie myth in mind. All the famous stories of rubbing the bottle and the genie pops out. You ask a question, but you don't really think it through, and it does something that you don't want. I think basically it's a genie myth problem.
Yeah, between Disney and Hollywood, we have all kind of the wrong ideas of what AI truly is. The systems we actually building are designed basically to be truth-seeking, and I'm talking about real AGI, not large language models, to be truth-seeking and to do things for us that we ask them to do. They don't have their own agenda, and there's no reason to believe that they will get their own agenda.
Well, just to play devil's advocate on that, why couldn't they, if they're self-learning, why couldn't they eventually diverge from human values and get their own preferences and do something that maybe not necessarily vicious, but something that would do us harm?
Where would that come from? I mean, the reason we have it is our selfish gene, basically, and you're not going to build that in. They are designed specifically. How would their goal system change? What would motivate that? There's really no reason to believe that. If you have a system that doesn't perform the way we engineer it, those are not the ones you're going to be selling or using because they're not going to be useful to us.
Yeah. Unless you're a psychopath or you want to.
And then hopefully there'll be enough good guys, and there'll be enough good guys and bad guys. And I have actually also written on something that typically is pretty controversial, but I do actually firmly believe that AGI will make us better people. That it essentially will be like having an angel on your shoulder. If we each have our own personal AGI, that's really more like an exocortex, an extension to our mind, that it'll help us make better decisions and kind of stay out of trouble, where it's like having your own personal philosopher and therapist, it can say, well, maybe you shouldn't invest in here right now. Maybe sleep on it or do a bit more research, or I'll do the research for you. Or maybe you shouldn't break off this relationship and sleep on it, or, it'll help keep us out of trouble, and also highlight some of the, things that people get swept up in, like you see in politics and religion and whatnot.
Yeah.
I think it'll help us be more rational, and therefore will help us flourish.
I think that's a really important point, because it's one I've been urging for quite a while. I've talked about the meta brain. He talked about the sort of exocortex idea. And it also came out recently because I've been writing about what it might be like when we're revived, if cryonics works, if we're revived in the future. And at the last Alcor conference, I had a session on that, which I was very disappointed in, frankly, because nobody even suggested the idea of having an AI assistant to help you. I mean, that's like the most obvious thing, right? Even today.
You're not going to be revived unless we already have AI to help solve the technical problems. Yeah.
So I think you're right that, there are, I mean, I'm very dissatisfied with myself. I think there's many ways I can be better. And I think, well, why can't I just change? But it's really tough, right? Because I'll give you a simple example, because I just bought a new device to help me with this. I have a lot of back problems, and I sit at my desk a lot, and I tend to start, leaning forward. And of course, people on their phones are always pointing down, and so you tend to get, shoulders rolling forward, you get back pains. So I've just bought a device that you stick on the back of your neck, and anytime you start doing this, it gives you like a warning beep or something. That's a very simple example, but an AI system that was following what you were doing, which you can already do that. Just everything you say, things you do, might sort of whisper in your ear, you might consider saying this instead, or have you considered?
Right.
Yeah, I think that could be a very valuable thing, given that we don't yet have the technology to actually hack our brains and rewire them directly, which I think eventually we will, so we'll have better self-understanding. But having a constant companion and kind of a coach and analyst and that kind of thing could be very valuable. And it might even be that, here's an idea. Maybe we pass a law requiring all politicians to use these devices when they're negotiating.
Right. It reminds me of the James Halperin's book, The Truth Machine, as well, where you can then have a green light or red light, depending on whether they're telling the truth. Yeah. Well, we actually call this concept a personal assistant, and I double up on the word personal, that you own it. It serves your agenda, not some mega corporation. And the second personal is it's highly personalized to you, with your goals and dreams and history and whatever. Mm-hmm. And that's very much what I'm working towards, is to also have the financial partners that will agree with us that we want to make this available to every person, this personal assistant, where they are no longer the product, Mm-hmm. I think that's really important to help humanity, is every person can have that little angel on their shoulder, or that coach or philosopher.
Oh, great. Well, I had a couple of things, but I think we can do another discussion. I wanted to talk a bit about the role of robotics and the rate of change you would expect. But let's hold on to that for another time, because that's a whole other topic. And I like the way I think there's a good topic to conclude on, a good optimistic area that people don't generally discuss. Unless you have anything further that you particularly want to say.
No, I think this is exciting, and again, I'm so happy to have met you, and the ideas I've got from Extra P. It's a positive, rational, self-responsibility, proactive optimism. I think we need more of that.
I'm going to try. People keep telling me I need to bring that back, because transhumanism's kind of blurred out into all kinds of different things. So maybe we'll bring it back.
Please do.
Yeah. Okay.
All right, Max.
All right, Peter. Thanks very much.
Yeah.